side.
Yeah. But what about just acknowledging? What's the difference between acknowledging your emotions and accepting them?
Mm. When I do my trainings, I use the word attending to emotions, because attending and the word attending and the word tender come from the same root, which is to move towards. And so I think again, it's towards that goal of integration. Is I want to understand you first. Then there's going to come acceptance. Once I understand you, I have yet to see a lack of that happen. Because once we get to know a part, we accept it, and then you're just welcome. Then you're here. You're who I am. You're part of me.
Yeah,
and I appreciate you.
Yeah, that acceptance of like present, you can be here and then you can also function. I like that next step into like the physiology of it, of like, you know, if you look at our organs in our bodies, the liver has a role, the gallbladder has a role, and when you're missing one, there's a bit of an adjustment to the whole system. And so if you think of like that harmonious interaction of all of those organs, but if we shift that over to all of the emotions, when the right circumstances rise, hate will show up and be like, hey, I am made for this. Cool, I got you. And the same as shame and sadness and happiness and joy and all of the other ones. And if we don't, like if we're missing a gallbladder, say, if we're missing one of the emotions, or if we just let it be there but don't let it act, you're going to have somebody else taking over a role that isn't as suited for it, that doesn't really have the skills to do it. And so it's that step forward that's like very dynamic into, I don't just let you be here, I'll let you actually speak and move and flow almost.
Right. So in that way, hate's kind of like the one that keeps an eye on our tendency to judge and exile and says, we need that member back in the tribe. It serves an important function. It can't be isolated and pushed out.
Yeah. And I think that like habits of self-sabotage, it can actually be the way that hate is pointing us to the thing that we need to get our next step. Like I see so many people do really well to a point and then their behavior will shift and then they lose their progress in their perspective and maybe in actuality too. But it's like they got up to that moment where, hey, you need this other part of you that you didn't want to have, and so you shoved it into shadow. And the process brings you right there so you can see it, and it's like, ooh, I don't want to yet. And so you'll go into this like cul-de-sac of different behavior.
Yeah, I think I could do a whole half hour just on self-sabotage and the emotions involved in that one.
Yeah, maybe we can put that in a different talk. Something I'm curious about is, so we're talking about this kind of like a cycle of self-hatred. And so how do you even begin to break the cycle?
I think what Sarah was saying about put it out there, I find that actually seeing what's happening, and then, I mean, I don't really see that it's possible almost to break the cycle without somehow changing one's relationship to one's emotions. I mean, it's like such a like a cycling. How do you break it? How do you create the pauses? You know, how do you create the pause to feel, the pause to identify and to respond, like in the what Carla talks about. And I've seen that in the Alexander technique. I teach the Alexander technique as well, and it's creating that. Alexander called it inhibition, the ability to receive a stimulus and to create a gap between the stimulus and the response, because the responses to our emotions are so. If we really think that anger and hatred and they're all bad, and we shouldn't have them, we can't express them, we can't even take them out and look at them, then it's very hard to create anything happen in between the gap between the stimulus and the response. Somehow something has to come in to create that pause, to create that challenge of those old ideas somehow. And that's hard, I think. We're in it. We don't know we're in it.
Right. So it takes some
We're slaves to it, but we don't know we're slaves.
So it seems like it starts with self-awareness and being able to point to and say, hey, this is happening to me. And you can write it out on paper or speak it out and have somebody speak it back to you and say, this is what you're saying is happening to you, or this is what is happening. But I think, from personal experience here, I've noticed that there's definitely shame in acknowledging self-hatred. Like knowing, oh, I shouldn't be doing this, I'm still doing it. So there's that kind of self-silencing shame happening as well, like on top of the self-hatred shame cycle thing. But at the root, it just seems like it's self-awareness that can get you started. And then I really love what you're talking about, the pause. And I was just imagining putting some kind of a physical barrier between yourself and like your next step. So, Heather, you're an acupuncturist, and you were talking about how people hate the pain, right? But that pain is that barrier, right?
Yeah. And like
that pain is like saying, hey, pause, wait a second here.
Totally. And believe
pay
me,
attention.
The irritation and resentment to needing to pause is this whole different thing. To be able to I love that pause idea, and also the take it out so you can see it, because so often the hate is so interconnected to whatever quality it is that we have exiled, that we don't actually see that there's two things in there. There's hate, and then there's this part of ourselves. And when people slow down enough so they're like, wait a minute, the hate is not the part of myself, there's this interesting stasis of letting things move, so potentially they can reclaim that part of themselves and not identify it with that self-hatred as well, because the hatred was really just the spotlight almost. And so that space to pull the feeling apart from the subject, or I don't know what the right word is also really needed. So that step really goes along with what Sue was saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and EMDR is one of the things I do, and we look for the core negative belief that a person has, and then trace a history of memories that inform that belief. And oftentimes the I'm not good enough is like the core negative belief that everything else branches from. But I read this one author who said there's one layer deeper than that you have to attend to, which is if your client believes that I'm not allowed to be emotional, I'm not allowed to have emotions, you need to work on that core belief first before you even work on the basic one of I'm not good enough, because the core belief of I'm not allowed to have emotions is going to interfere with being able to process I'm not good enough. And I thought that was a really astute, and she's not DEI informed, obviously, but I thought that was a really astute observation on her part, because that, as Sue was saying, that's like the first thing that needs to happen is we need to be able to have access to our emotions to navigate these waters. And if you have beliefs that tell you being emotional is not appropriate, then shame is going to show up to make sure you do not get emotional, right? Because it's loyal like that.
Sarah, you just blew my mind.
Right.
You just
Right, and
explained to me that it makes so much more sense now.
yes. And then to Heather's point, in internal family systems, they talk about exiles, they put that word to it, these exiled, usually younger parts that are holding the trauma. And one of the important messages to get to those parts is that they are not the trauma. They are carrying the burden of the trauma, but they are not the trauma themselves. They are not the bad thing. They are not the scary thing. They are not the defective thing. They have been carrying the burden of those beliefs for us. And so once they can get that, and we can help release them from their burden, they can just be them. They can just be who they are and do what they do. But it all starts with emotions. We have to first make sure that emotions are welcome. Because emotions help us with all of this. And without emotions, it's just in the head, it's just intellectual, and it just keeps us in that loop.
Wow, Sarah, thank you.
Yes.
Awesome. Any last thoughts?
Well, I think for me, like when I first joined DEI, hate was one of the ones that came up really early, because there was some big stuff that I was working through. And now, after a couple years of work and experience with it, shadow work is one of the most rewarding things to establish a relationship with, and hate is that partner now.
Mm-hmm.
that I'm like, hey, I know I used you to throw it away, and I know you helped me bring it back.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a very like honorable relationship that can occur in that, which was really surprising when I think like, wow, that was me developing a relationship with hate. Oh, okay. It was quite astounding. So while it's really hard in the beginning, I do encourage people to keep going and explore.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's whenever I feel that sense of hatred coming up in myself, now I know to start paying attention. Oh, and I think of it in shamanic terms. I'm a trained shamanic practitioner, so I think of it in terms of soul parts, or like a part of me that left at some point in my life and it's ready to return, and maybe I have turned my back on it or valenced it in some way to make it a bad part of myself, right? But it's this part that wants to come back, whether it's the part of me that wants to make art or be silly and sing, or we can have hatred around lots of things. So yeah, like you're saying, Heather, it's kind of like a welcoming. And it's not easy. I'm not gonna like sugarcoat this at all. Like you're still gonna have those hatred feelings.
Yep.
Those are still gonna be there.
Yeah, hate is long-term work, just like shame is long-term work. It's not a one and done kind of thing like some other emotional work can be. But it is so deep and enriching and rewarding. And I'm always happy when hate is named with a client, because then I'm like, okay, now we get to the real stuff and we get to go inward, because lots of therapy can be talking about other people and what they're doing wrong, which oftentimes is legit, right? But when you're talking about hate, it's like, oh, now we're in the internal worlds. This is where the magic happens, if we can actually walk this path.
Sue, do you have last thoughts?
I mean, I was just thinking similar thoughts really with the suicidal urge. It's awesome, but it's not talked about. It's deeply in the shadow. And I had a very interesting conversation with a therapist who was on my last workshop, and she said it just really helped her with her clients, you know, to just talk about it in that way and have another way to look at it. You know, it's not us that has to die, but something has to die. Something needs to end. And yeah, so I think especially eating disorders, which can be really vicious, probably, you know, there's something going on there as well. So that was just going around in my head as well, talking about hatred.
Thank you all for joining me today. What a rich, juicy conversation we just had about self-hatred, you know, just these light topics.